Bonjour.
Hello. Welcome to our session on the new way of addressing farming or agriculture. I'm Akiko SUWA-EISENMANN from the Cercle des Économistes. So we have many different important things to talk about. Of course, we all know that food prices are going up. There are shortages. We're talking about agriculture here. This is a very important subject. Do we need to transform agriculture? And if we do, how do we go about this? To find out, we have a wonderful panel with us. Sitting by me, I've got Arnaud ROUSSEAU, who is the head of a group called Avril, which works in oils and proteins. I also have Thierry BLANDINIÈRES, who is general manager of In Vivo, the second biggest cooperative in France, working in cereals, seeds, wine, in France and abroad. And remotely, we will be speaking to Jennifer CLAPP, who's a professor at the University of Waterloo in Canada, and she is vice president of a panel of experts that works on world food safety. It's an international organization from the private and the public sector. And we also have with us Mr. Mohamed MANSSOURI, director of the United Nations unit for farming. Before I hand the floor to them, I'd like to take a few words just to give you some background information. And I'm going to structure my presentation in terms of time. So the world before, the world afterwards, and the world that we have now. So first of all, close your eyes. Just remember that world before, the one before January 2020. In the world before, agriculture was seen as a traditional sector, unlike other more modern sectors. Close your eyes and you can see the pictures flashing before your eyes. Growth was bounced in innovation, technology, sometimes without even any factories. In the combat to use land, agriculture would always lose the battle because it had to move over and make space for these new innovative industries. The same thing for labor. Their workers were going to other business sectors. So there were fewer farmers, they were getting older, and they were not very well represented politically. Farming was just supposed to be producing a lot with less land and fewer people. They had to provide food, which didn't cost a lot, so that the other sectors would not have to increase salaries. So there was a race towards increased agricultural yield. Now let's take a look at the future. Farming of the future will stand on two pillars. The first one will be climate change. Climate change and water scarcity will redefine the land that is available and what can be grown on that land. Climate change means we have to change our practices, even if it means not maximizing our yields. Speeds will vary. Some regions will have too much land available. In Europe, for example, and in the north and the east of Europe, but other areas such as Africa won't have enough. The solution for balancing all of this out is, of course, trade. In the world afterwards, we will be needing even more international trade of agricultural goods. To get back to the world today, after COVID and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we know that trade is very fragile and it is impacted when a port or a road is closed. There's a big gap between what is available for exchanges and the amount that is being produced. For Ukraine and wheat, well, Ukraine is quite a small player in a world scale, 3%, but it's really big in terms of exports, 10% of the world's exports. So between the world before, the world after, well, what's agriculture's path? Before we go into the nitty-gritty, let's talk about the news with our panelists. So what's the situation today? as far as the food crisis is concerned, at the beginning of July 2022. I'm going to start with Thierry BLANDINIÈRES, who is at the head of InVivo. InVivo is present in the Ukraine. Can you tell us what the farming situation is like over there? First of all, thank you very much, everybody. I'm delighted to be here at this round table with the group called Avril. We're very complementary in our business activities. We were competitors, now we're complementary, so we'll be able to do lots about crop rotation and all the rest of it. So it's really interesting to have two big French groups with an international dimension that have the same view of sustainable farming of the future. So let's talk about Ukraine. Yep, we were all gobsmacked when war was declared. We had 400 employees in Ukraine. We've got factories there. We make malt so that the brewers can work. We are present in different crops. We sell all kinds of products related to crop growing. We are exporters. We have trading offices in Odessa and at Kiev. We are also in Russia. We have 300 employees in Russia who do the same thing. So when the war kicked off, we were absolutely gobsmacked. No one knew what was happening. We had to call everything to a halt. We needed to protect our employees and identify what we could do to help them because they were our employees. We had to protect them. And then the cereal prices went up a lot. There's quite a bit of speculation. The wheat prices rocketed, and that set the market on fire, and that started a whole inflationary trend, tied in with the gas prices, of course, because we have we were impacted by that. We had to manage the local crisis with all of these price hikes. So in economic terms, it was really hard to keep track with everything. Since then, Kiev has survived. It hasn't fallen yet. The west of the Ukraine, in farming terms, is up and running again. Farming is going ahead, full scale. It's a bit difficult in terms of cash flow, but activities are funded. We have French banks over there helping us. And right now, we have been able to sow seeds for the spring, which is important for oil-based, such as sunflower. And Arnaud, I'm sure, will be talking about the French market. And we also thought about the harvest, the forthcoming harvest. So we can see that it's going to be very hard to have good visibility for September, October, on the right attitudes to have for the harvest in Russia and Ukraine, because we're talking about the harvest in Ukraine, 30 million tons, whereas it's more than double in Russia. So all in all, we have 100 million tons to harvest. Out of that, 170 million, 70% is exported via Odessa. The problem we face is what is going to happen. Are we going to be able to sell this cereal using other channels? In Europe, they've been trying to find some land-based solutions via Constanza. But in terms of solutions, we are not yet sure that we're going to be able to export all of that grain. So we've got this big wall up ahead of us. Meanwhile, the price of cereal is going down. One could have imagined with this big brick wall ahead of us, the price of cereals would go up 400, 450, 500, 600, but that's not the case today. On the contrary, the prices are down at about 330 a ton. We all have reasons why that could be the case. No one really holds the truth. But I think we've got another wall in front of us. That's the wall of inflation and a decrease in demand, potentially. And the markets have started to anticipate that fall in demand, and that is reflected in the prices. However, when we're talking about markets, we're not talking about physical flows, we're talking about price positioning in the long term, and to give investors visibility. So it's all very complicated. A lot of uncertainty about September. If an agreement can be found about the Odessa corridor, then there will be cereal which will drop. And then, of course, if the tension is tightened, then prices could increase, but it's all very difficult. We have no visibility whatsoever. However, the global flow of the production of cereal is at a good level. If there's not any other major climatic incident that kicks in. So if I had a crystal ball, I would give you the price for the month of October, but I cannot give it to you today. It's very complex. We have to manage that. We have to adapt quickly in the coming weeks, and we have to take up the proper positions. We have to be a bit brave and bold in terms of the Ukrainian harvest. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand the floor now to Jennifer Clapp, who is with us from Canada by video conference. She is a specialist in food system management. Jennifer, this current crisis, is it unique? Has it never been experienced before? What's your point of view?
Thank you very much, Akiko, for the introduction and also the invitation to be here. Yeah, this crisis, it's not unique. That's one of the messages I wanted to say, in the sense that, of course, the particulars are unique, but this is the third food crisis we've experienced in the last 15 years. And it's important that we understand what's going on in the background. But in terms of your question about what's going on right now, this is this week, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN and other Rome-based agencies that work on food security published their new numbers on hunger and undernutrition. And they're quite alarming figures. We now see that in 2021, 823 million people were experiencing chronic undernutrition, and 2.3 billion people are facing food insecurity at a moderate or severe level. And that was the number before the impact of the war in Ukraine. So obviously, this is a difficult situation because the numbers are going in the wrong direction. We're not ending hunger. It's getting worse. And so it demands a response. But what I wanted to stress is that we must ensure that the responses that we make in the short term to this crisis do not work against the long-term goal of achieving more sustainable and equitable food systems. And that's a key message of the report on the food crisis coming out of the Ukraine war from the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition. So while there's a lot of concern right now about getting the grain that's stuck in Ukraine out through a humanitarian corridor, as Thierry just mentioned, I would say that we're not actually in a situation of absolute global food shortage right now. And although we hear a lot about this in the media, that there are shortages, in absolute terms, that's not the case in the global sense. Stock-to-use ratios, for example, for wheat, that's the amount of wheat in storage compared to what is utilized, is actually at levels that were similar to past years, maybe down a little bit, but not nearly as low as they were during the 2008 food crisis. So it's a situation not of an absolute shortage, but rather it's a situation of high food prices and food price inflation, as was already mentioned. And we know that this food price inflation was actually happening even before Russia invaded Ukraine. And the causes are multifaceted, as was already mentioned by Thierry, but obviously supply chain disruptions, blockages due to the war, also disruptions due to COVID-19 pandemic, the increased price of oil and fertilizers that's driving up farm costs is also a problem. And we could also mention the role of financial actors in speculating on commodity futures markets. As Thierry mentioned, the price of wheat had gone way up at the beginning of the conflict, but it's also come down, and the financial press has reported that a lot of this tendency, or rather the trends going up and down, are partly related to financial investment moving in and out of the commodities sector. So in short, what we're seeing now is a problem of an unaffordability of food, not a shortage of food. And so in this sense, it would be, I would say, a mistake if industrialized countries embark on a huge program of intensifying agricultural production using, moving into sensitive lands that had been set aside for conservation, or using high levels of synthetic chemicals that can cause problems. This would be a big mistake because it would undermine the goal of sustainability in food systems over the longer term. But there are responses that we can make right now to this dire situation to address rising levels of hunger. A key thing that can be done is to increase the amount of aid and assistance, in other words, money, that goes to people who are in low-income countries that are food import dependent. The poorest people are the ones facing this unaffordability crisis, which is the hardest on them. In many developing countries, low-income countries that are food import dependent, the poorest members of society often spend up to 60% of their income on food. So these are the people who are the hardest hit by this crisis, and they need assistance. We can also think about reducing the non-food uses of the cereals and grains that we produce. So already we know that almost 50% of what is produced in terms of cereals is not directly consumed by humans. It goes to biofuels, and it also goes to animal feed. So if we think about reducing the biofuel mandates or switching to eat less meat, this is another way that we can respond to the crisis without undermining sustainability in the long term. Addressing commodity speculation is another kind of measure that can be taken to limit the positions that financial investors can take in agricultural commodity markets, because these do filter through to real prices. So I'll just stop there. I know I've probably been talking for too long, but there's a number of things that we can do to not undermine the goal of long-term sustainability, but while dealing still with addressing the hunger crisis in the short term.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'll hand over the floor now to Arnaud Rousseau, the president of the Avril Group. You're a farmer, and you're a former military. So with all these two hats, these experiences, how do you understand this geopolitical crisis? What's your understanding of this crisis? Well, hello everybody. Thank you for the invitation. And I can assure you that we're very interested in these discussions. Quick word on Avril. It's an industrial and agro-food company in France with a specificity. We're a specialist of oils and vegetable proteins. It's a model. We don't pay dividends to our shareholders because we operate in the long term, and we have as a strong will, our reason of being, to serve the earth, the land. What we observe today is that the food issue is at the center of our the debates. We had forgotten that in Europe, left it aside, because we all belong to generations who were never faced with a food crisis of any sort. And the paradigm, and you described that, it was to produce. And this is what happened in the 70s, for example. We weren't concerned with the issues around the world. Today, we clearly see that climate change and the environment concerns, the collapse of biodiversity, is a challenge to take up for agriculture, with the double ambition of continuing to produce. We see what's happening in terms of flows. This was reminded earlier, and it's absolutely necessary also to take into account the question of transitions and changes that we will be facing. Transitions, well, there's a transition in terms of production. How we continue to produce, reducing carbon emissions, using less pesticides, while keeping the production level, enabling the emergence of innovation, research, biocontrols, organic productions, but with the ambitions of producing. Because you said there may be 10 countries, a dozen of countries are capable of exporting foodstuff. A lot of countries produce for their self-sufficiency or on their immediate markets, but products that can be, in the long run, supply the planet, well, there are very few. And when one is missing, and this was perfectly described with Ukraine, you see the impact this has on the world food situation. And so I think this advantage of my having the floor here is we need to gain momentum, but radicality, which is something that we often talk about, will not enable us to reach our objectives. because we have to be very attentive to the how we can bear this burden. And this is what's happening in the Netherlands, for example. It sheds a big light on this, on what you shouldn't do. The second thing is the energy transition. We forgot that, but carbon. In recent years, you know, carbon was, oil was used everywhere. Petrochemical products were used, and the food stuff was, you know, we fed animals. It was true with biofuels. Biofuels. Somebody said just before me, you know, there was a problem about biofuels. I think we have to strike the right balance between the foodstuff production, which is our first responsibility, but also agriculture tomorrow can be a contributor through biofuels as long as it's balanced. And biofuels in Europe have a specificity, is that we produce proteins, and we know our country depends a lot on proteins. And of course, there's the problem of deforestation. So we have to consider biofuels according to their origins. For biogases, for example, we can also bring forth some responses, and the food transition with the health aspects, nutrition, but also the way tomorrow we'll be able to use more vegetable proteins and less animal proteins. And so there are some challenges to face, and the question of soils also. How will we cover soils? Carbon farming is an issue, the issue of water, world issue. We have to strike the right balance. You know, within some territories there's no agriculture if there's no water. And for innovation in Europe, in Brussels, a lot of discussions on there's a lot of thought given to the new techniques to use less pesticides, have plants that better resist to drought. We have genetic solutions that can address this, and with innovation we can rapidly make progress on this. And so we can rethink agriculture, not with radical changes, because our enterprises are open-air companies. We always depend on the climate and external constraints, but with a strong will to respond, to take up the challenges, which are deal with production and transition. And for this, we will need a strong willpower. This was reminded in the opening session. It's an integrated policy. 30% of the European budget is dedicated to agriculture. How do we accompany our neighbor countries? We talk about food sovereignty. But for us, food sovereignty is at the European scale, with a closer look on the Mediterranean basin and the African countries. We're not being paternalistic. It's how we work on co-development to make sure that the developments, innovation benefit these populations, how we also accompany the potentials that we find there. So I think we can change things rapidly. Two elements are pre-required. The first one is the income of farmers. We're here at the Cercle des Économistes. Enterprises cannot live if they don't have an income. And we know the first the issue of revenue is a major issue in European agriculture, and we have to be attractive for newcomers in our activity. A lot of people are retiring soon, and if we want to take up the challenge of the replacement of these people, we have to make this activity attractive and that feeds the people who do this activity. Thank you. Talking about the crisis and the future of farmers, Monsieur Mohamed MANSSOURI, Director of the FAO Investment Centers. You're an agronomist, long experience of African countries. Arnaud Rousseau just talked about. Jennifer also talked about this relationship on the report, I'm sorry, on food security. What can you say about the present crisis?
Yeah, thanks, Akiko, and many thanks for inviting me to the Cercle des Économistes. It's a great pleasure to be on this panel. And actually, Jennifer, like you cited that the emerging food, energy, and financial crisis is pushing more people into extreme poverty and hunger. Even before the pandemics and war in Ukraine, the world was not on track to end hunger and malnutrition in all its form by 2030. And according to the SOFI report that has just been published, more than 150 million people have fallen into hunger, reaching, in 2 years between 2019 and 21, reaching something like to 828 million people who are hungry today. So the crisis, what I can tell about it is more about how we respond to the crisis from the FAO perspective. It calls for a timely humanitarian response to mitigate the immediate impacts, and to this end, FAO, in coordination with many other agencies, is providing assistance focusing on the most vulnerable rural men and women, including internally displaced people affected by the crisis in Ukraine. And this is done through a number of instruments: cash transfers, support to agricultural inputs for crops and livestock, for farmers, especially the smallholder farmers in Ukraine, with the focus on spring vegetable planting for the time being, but also providing regular information on the food security situation in Ukraine. And beyond that, we are also, talking to many partners and to the government of Ukraine on what are the plans for food and agriculture rehabilitation the day, hopefully, peace will come back. As FAO, we have issued a number of policy recommendations to guide countries towards measures that protect global food security. And this includes supports to vulnerable groups, and I think Jennifer has spoken to that, through a variety of instruments, humanitarian assistance where it is needed, but also social protection that targets the most vulnerable groups, also school feeding programs for the schools in poor areas. One major recommendation is to keep trade open for food, fuel, and fertilizer, to avoid ad hoc policy reactions like export restrictions. And as you know, a number of countries have issued bans for exports of some foodstuffs. Diversification of food supplies and import sources is very important. Strengthening the market transparency and dialogue, and provide timely information. And in this respect, the use of digital means, the access to information and data, like the Agricultural Market Information System, AMIS, that can help reduce the perception of uncertainty in the global market, maintain the trade flows, and it also, helps increase transparency and encourages dialogue and coordination among producing, exporting, importing countries. For the very poor countries, the poorest countries, the most affected, we also advocate for, facilities for import of food and fertilizer, including provision of finance or blended finance, working capital to importers and SMEs to avoid disruptions. And finally, one very important thing, and we may come to that later, is to prepare for other risks, such as disease outbreaks and even nuclear risks. And this is very important, that our member countries be also prepared for more risks than what we are facing today. But to solve the food crisis, and I will join the other panelists here, it is not only about responding in the short term, but it's about getting the world back on track to achieve the SDGs. We need to address those structural changes that affect our agri-food systems, have a longer term vision with focus on critical policies, innovations, and investments that promote inclusive economic growth through job creation, especially for the youth, improved nutrition and health, sustainable natural resource management and use, and greater equity and climate resilience. Thank you.
Merci Mohamed, vous avez déjà... Donc, merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mohamed. you've proposed a very concerning overview, but I think but the solutions, of course, are quite innovative, so that's very interesting. So I think that now we can try to work along those lines. So to see what we can say, how we can rethink the future agriculture, or the agriculture of the future. We've talked a lot since this morning about the arbitrations, how we can bring together the short-term needs and the preparation of the long-term. So I'd like to go to the panel members to ask them a question. The future. But is this future close to us? Is it far? Is it remote? Thierry. Well, I think we were already working at preparing the future before the sanitary crisis and the present Ukrainian crisis. What's happening with both these crises is that we are in a moment where we're gaining momentum with innovation. Fortunately, they're too few, but there are solutions in the toolbox. So to ensure a sustainable agriculture and competitive form of agriculture, what does this mean, this toolbox? We have to think of agriculture of precision, how to produce more with less and better. This is becoming possible thanks to new technologies, thanks to digital solutions, thanks to our capacity to better understand the agronomical potential of plots, and for the farmer using less fertilizers and mechanically increase his or her revenue. When we talk about transition in Europe, we talk a lot about organic products and organic surfaces. And in the program Farm to Fork, we had some worries on this program, which were legitimate. If you use 25% more organic surfaces in Europe, you see the restrictions, the limit with a view to the prices and the reactions of our consumers and how these products were sanctioned. You can't oppose methods, but we have to rethink the full potential of the European farm. Where it's possible to produce organically with a competitive cost, fine, but when it's not possible and you run the risk of lowering the yields, well, you have to think sustainability. And sustainability in the sense of climate change, taking into account the quality of the soils and the challenge of crop rotations, vegetable for 5 years, for example, changing production, cereals, orient farmers in this kind of production, establishing contracts with different cultures, with different operators. That's where we can find the economic solution to make sure that the farmer improves its revenue while promoting this sustainable and competitive agriculture. The quality of soil, the biodiversity has to be better qualified. We're lacking criteria, but the sustainable label, well, we need to have it to agree in Europe and worldwide on what we understand by sustainable agriculture. I know that today a lot of solutions are starting to get harmonized. In Europe, the US and Brazil is different, but maybe we can give a new impulse for this transition as we finance the organic transition. So this is a public politics issue with the customers also, how they will help us to impulse how to recognize a premium product at the level of the price, enabling to finance this transition. We have pilot farms that exist, and we've already measured the economic stake. I can give you a figure, but when you give a figure, this often opens up debates. But we think that with a safety net of 150 euros per hectare on 5-year rotations, we can involve the farmers in this program. And 150 euros per hectare can be financed, this still on the conditional mode, with public policies, with maybe a bonus on prices, but also with the valuing of carbon credits, which is a new income for farmers. And when we manage to bring all this together, well, maybe there is a solution. This is a solution which is not that remote, that far-fetched. The idea is to change scales. We have to involve as many farmers as possible in France and Europe on this new approach. And I think that by the coming years, we'll be capable of producing more sustainably and at a competitive price. We know that inflation is a big stake right now, big challenge, and it's okay. I think that innovation is a key element in seeds. We talked a lot about. There's a lot of money to invest in seeds, protection of seeds, the coding, protection of the plants, limiting chemical treatments. And beyond all this, rise the quality level, increase the quality level, but with a good cost-quality ratio. The idea is that the European farm should be the first world farm capable of highlighting this sustainable or promoting this sustainable agriculture so that we can solve the equation of producing more and better with less and cheaper. Thank you.
Jennifer,
Jennifer, I would like to put the same question to you. The agriculture of the future, with all of these different players and the small farmers, the big groups, what's it going to look like? What might things look like?
And I think, obviously, while, as was previously mentioned, innovation and technology are important, I think we also need to think about addressing the underlying structural problems that make current food systems quite vulnerable to shocks. In other words, if we don't address some of those bigger underlying issues, we could still run into serious problems. And there are several big structural flaws in food systems that need to be corrected, and I just want to focus on one of them, given the time constraint, and that's the problem with concentration. And this problem of concentration actually cuts across a number of areas in food systems. For example, we have concentrated diets. The global food system currently revolves around just a handful of staple crops. Wheat, maize, and rice, for example, account for almost 50% of human diets. We have concentrated production systems. Staple crops are grown in intensive monocultural fashion using huge energy resources that can cause environmental damage to biodiversity and use water resources. We also have concentrated producing and exporting countries. So, for example, just a handful of countries are actually the major suppliers of grain to global markets. The European Union plus just 7 countries account for almost 90% of the world's wheat trade, and just 4 countries account for almost 80% of the world's maize trade. And also we have concentrated commercial trade. The grain trade, for example, is actually dominated by just 4 private companies. So these concentrated features of food systems are important to address, in particular because they make food systems very inflexible in the face of shocks. And this concentration, it really came into place over the last 150 years. And these kind of systems prevailed because they were designed to maximize efficiency and scale through specialization. And they were also politically supported by very powerful actors. But these systems, as I said, the specialized systems are very rigid. They don't allow for a lot of slack in the system when shocks happen. And so they can actually, although they're portrayed by their proponents as being very efficient, they can actually be quite costly when things go wrong. So climate crisis, war, economic distress, these may have once seemed like they were the exception rather than the rule, but in recent decades we've seen they've become the norm rather than the exception. So I would argue that for the future, back to your question, we should really be prioritizing resilience in food systems. And what we need to make food systems more resilient is to infuse greater diversity into all of these aspects of food systems. So for example, we need to expand the range of countries and regions that produce staple foods in order to reduce concentration in the production and export of those crops. For example, many countries in sub-Saharan Africa are heavily reliant on imports for staple grains, and the continent's food import bill has increased by a factor of 3 in recent decades. So by smoothing out and spreading out the production of staple grains, this can help build more resilience into the system. We also need a wider variety of foods being produced, going beyond these 3 major staple crops, to include more emphasis on traditional and ecologically appropriate crops. So for example, like teff and millet and cassava. This can help to reduce the reliance on just a handful of staple grains. And diversity is good ecologically as well as in terms of diets, a diverse range of crops. And we also need more diverse and sustainable production practices. And this was mentioned by Thierry that innovations like precision agriculture, et cetera, can help. But we also want to think about other low chemical input agriculture models like agroecology that can really use diversity within the field to help improve sustainability and absorb rather than release carbon. And we also need more food to be delivered through local and regional markets, or what we call the HLPE and the Committee on World Food Security refers to as territorial markets that can help to reduce reliance on concentrated global value chains. I'm not saying we need to do away with all global trade, but we just need a better balance and a better mix between local and regional markets supplying food as well as global supply chains. So in short, diversity is the key to ensuring food systems can provide alternative options when shocks occur. And that diversity is also beneficial for ecological sustainability, for providing livelihoods, as well as for improving nutrition. Thank you.
Merci Jennifer.
What were they saying?
Donc, diversification dans toutes les directions.
Jennifer earlier on was talking about that arbitration, the difference, the importance of finance, food, feed, fuel. You have to choose whether you're feeding humans or animals, or whether you're creating biofuels. So what do we do? Well, of course, things will continue in the same. A business manager makes decisions every day in their business. I know that we have a session scheduled on this subject. However, the question of redefining the model, or how the model is defining, do we want to look for a growth model or a negative growth model? So we should put this question on the table. As far as we're concerned, as farmers in France, we are in favor of growth. So sobriety has to be an undercurrent. So how can we do better in production conditions that are favorable for the business with revenue, so that we can invest and we can look to the future, favorable for the consumer? We haven't really talked about the consumer, but because consumers too will determine how farming develops in the future. They have their say. We're talking a lot today about consumer habits and purchasing power. And then the farmer will make their choices. We've talked about the size of the farms, or the choice of business model. In France, biofuels account for 2.5% of services. Organic farming 10%, and the rest is traditional farming. So when you're looking at on a planetary scale, you should keep that in mind. And of course, I took that point about being balanced but diversified. We need a business model that is sustainable. To be able to feed your business leader and to make sure that there are future generations that will follow on, then we have to be profitable. If we take a look at the African continent, which is the major sufferer of malnutrition, then the farmers go to the big cities and then they leave their farmland. So let's take a look at this relevance of choices, and the business heads need to manage their farms. There's a political aspect, we perhaps will have a chance to talk about that. Then there's also the choice made by consumers, and then there's financial backing from public players and local authorities, for example. There are NGOs as well, and there are big finances around the planet. And I think if we are to hope, we have to harmonize it. We don't have a lot of time left. But in the face of this global problem of climate warming, as the IPCC underlined, we don't have any time to mess about. Let me take the example of carbon. We want a carbon market on a worldwide scale. A local approach to carbon just doesn't stand up. The French market, it's 35 to 40 euros compared to a ton of carbon in Brazil or India where it's 5 euros. So there are some variables that come into play. If we want to move forward, we really need harmonization. Christine Lagarde was talking about the G20. So for these particular international subjects, we have to have a global approach so that locally we can take the right decisions. And we can have indicators that tell us how we are really progressing, and we need to have targets which are dated and with the statistics to back them up. Mr. Mansouri, earlier on you concluded by saying that there will be other crises, there will be other risks. I presume that boils down to a problem of governance, local governance perhaps, and a global approach. What can we do on a global scale to solve these problems of governance in agriculture?
Yeah, thank you very much. Go again, and I'm happy that we are addressing the issues not only from the agricultural, through agriculture, but through food systems. Okay, so which makes the most of the issues more complex, but more inclusive, because whether we are consumers or producers, we are on the same boat. And actually, it doesn't make any sense if we, for example, support production and we don't look at the post-farm activities along the value chains and the efforts to be put into transforming the primary production in order to respond to the needs. Otherwise, those efforts at production level would be vain. So globally, the systems or the agri-food systems would need to become more resilient, and I think we all agree to that. The greener, healthier, more inclusive to deliver safe and nutritious food for all in the global, in the context of the 2030 agenda. Referring to your question more about governance, actually the food system there is a global, there is a country, there is a local, there is a regional food systems. And I think this is part of that complexity that we have to deal with. And I think Jennifer addressed, some of those issues. And I think the food systems in the future need to strike that better balance between the global and the local, considering issues such as economies of scale, diversification, diversity, as she was putting it, transaction costs, carbon footprints, all what defines, the competitiveness. And I think in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine has shown the vulnerability of our entire agri-food systems, and some of those issues related to concentration that have been eloquently addressed by Jennifer before, the strong dependency and dominant trade connections between importing and exporting countries also do amplify certain risks and may cause also systemic failures. Today, governments and businesses are reassessing the risks and exposure to this trade system. We are starting also to hear calls for deglobalization. And I think rather than deglobalizing, we need to be just, localizing or globalizing more smartly. So it's more about smarter globalization or localization, like promoting competitive and sustainable local production, like fostering regional trade arrangements, like ECOWAS or the SADC in Africa, ensuring strategic and effective stock management and diversifying food sources and trading partners. One dimension which is in this, maybe not directly in this, debates about governance, but that is really empowering the consumers and the education of the consumers for them to be able to make the healthy and more environmentally sustainable food choices can also contribute to this smarter localization or globalization. So I will leave it here, but I just want to reiterate that today maybe the threat that we are faced with is more that multiplicity of simultaneous shocks and crises. So it's like a protracted crisis, and that we need to be equipped with, our countries need to be equipped to address those multiple crises that can result from conflicts and natural disasters and climate shocks and zoonotics and so on. And I think this is maybe the next, let's say, the next layer that we should really look at it is how to govern the risks and how to manage the risks in order to reduce them or to be able to manage them when they come. And this is really where FAO, is, supporting our governments, our member country governments in their strategic investment policies and capacity development in order to be able to do that and to be able to build back not business as usual, but hopefully much better. I don't want to give the impression that I'm a pessimistic. I think that we need to think maybe pessimistically, but to act very optimistically. Okay.
Merci beaucoup. Ce sera donc le mot de la fin parce que nous devons nous quitter. Mais
that is the wrap up for our session. Fine words there to close this session. So there are many risks, but there are a lot of good intentions to prepare the farming of the future. Thank you very much.